Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our study through the Gospel of John. We've studied in past sessions concerning Jesus' feasting with his disciples of the Passover. And at the Passover, Jesus did many startling things. First of all, he astonished the disciples by when they had finished the Passover meal, he took a basin of water and towel, cloth, and washed each of these disciples' feet. It was a humiliating thing as they viewed it. But Jesus was setting an example. He said, I'm your Lord and Master. You call me that, and that's the way it is. But if I've washed your feet, you need to wash one another's feet. Then, as they were in the midst of this discussion, Jesus further astonished them by saying, one of you is going to betray me. They wanted to know who, asking first, is it I? And finally, Peter asked John to ask Jesus who it was, and Jesus said, it is he, for whom I dip the sop and give it to him. And he did so. And to Judas, he said, what thou doest, do quickly. Then Jesus spoke to Peter, and he said, Simon, Simon, Satan have asked for thee, that he might sift thee as wheat. But I have made petition for you, that your faith fail not. And when thou hast turned again, strengthen your brethren. Now Peter said, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and death. And Jesus said something more astonishing to Peter. He said, Peter, this night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. The disciples went out into the garden, and Jesus prayed to the Father. The prayer that we've looked at weeks past, recorded in John the 17th chapter, in which Jesus prayed for himself, for the 11, for you and me. He prayed also in that hours before, if it be possible, Father, let this cup pass from me, albeit not my will, but thine be done. And then they waited. They waited because the betrayer was coming, the traitor. And just as Jesus had predicted, the traitor did identify Jesus to those that would take him, try him, crucify him. He betrayed him with a kiss. The disciples did not know what to do. One of the disciples said, Master, shall we smite with the sword? Jesus gives no answer. But then Peter took matters into his own hands. He drew his sword, he cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And Jesus said, Peter, put up your sword into the sheath again. They that take up the sword shall perish with the sword. And then he said, the cup that my Father hath given me to drink, shall I not drink it? Having been identified by Judas as the one they sought, the soldiers seized him. The disciples fled from the scene. They forsook him and fled. And as we look, we find that Jesus is taken by the soldiers, and they were taken away. And as they were taken away, they were carried into the high priest's house. When we look at the events that are before us, one of the disciples taking a sword 3 of the gospel accounts tell us that a disciple did cut off the servant of the high priest's ear, but they do not identify him. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that. Now, Luke tells something additionally that the other 2 does not add, and that is that Luke tells us that Jesus put forth his hand and healed the ear of that servant. Now, when we come to the Gospel of John, John records something that the other 3 did not. They did not identify who it was that cut the servant's ear off, but John does not hesitate. John said Peter did it. And as we look at that, John doesn't tell us about Jesus healing the servant, just simply said that Peter was the one. That's interesting because the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written while Peter was still alive, and John was written long after Peter was dead. But when Peter saw Jesus taken, he followed a ways, and John, his good friend and frequent comrade as they preached the good news of the approaching kingdom, John went to the high priest's house where Jesus was led. That same high priest whose servant Peter had cut off his ear. And Peter followed. Now John was known to the high priest, and he gained ready access to the high priest's home. He knew Peter wanted to see the proceedings, and so he went to the young maid that kept the door of the house and asked to let Peter in. And he did. And the record declared that that maiden asked him, "Are you one of this man's disciples?" Peter said, No, I'm not. Peter was in the lion's den. He was in the house of that high priest whose servant Peter had attacked by cutting his ear off. And as the hours went by, Jesus was being tried, being humiliated, and the disciples were waiting. Peter waited around as well. And he was in the courtyard. When he got into the courtyard, a fire had been built by the soldiers and by the servants of the high priest. Peter warmed himself by the fire. He saw him again and said to Peter, "Are you one of this man's disciples?" And again he strongly said, "I'm not." And then, as the hours grew on, the time passed, one of those servants, who incidentally was a kinsman to that servant whose ear Peter had cut off, that servant was more direct. He said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" Peter was cornered, so to speak. He said, "No," and he cursed and swore and said, "I don't know him." 2 things happened. The rooster began to crow. And Peter remembered, "Lord, I'll never deny you. I'll die with you." But he had. And as the rooster crowed, he chanced to look in another direction. And there stood Jesus looking at Peter. And Peter remembered. And he went out and he wept bitterly. There's some lessons that we may learn from this. First of all, of course, Peter had said that he was willing to go to prison and to death for Jesus, and he went well have been. He did later in his life die for the Lord. But Jesus restrained him from that. What was he to do? Jesus had forbade him to take up any acts of violence. So what would he do to protect his master? Perhaps he felt helpless, frustrated. But he knew that he believed Jesus was the Son of God. And as we look at Peter, the first lesson that we learn is that Peter overestimated his strength. He thought he would never deny the Lord, but he was not near so strong as he thought that he was. Jesus warns, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. A second thing that Peter did not contemplate was Satan. His temptations were stronger, much stronger than he had anticipated. And his power was great. And Peter had magnified his chances of denying the Lord by going into a place that was hostile. The one that tried the master. The one whose servants Peter had cut off the ear. It was a very hostile environment. Doubtlessly, this all factored into the fact that he did. And my friends, we need to learn a lesson from Peter. We need to recognize that we're not always as strong as we think we are. Sometimes we think that we can withstand temptation. Therefore, we should always be careful. Don't place ourselves in a situation that we're going to be tempted above that we're able. Like Peter, we need to recognize that Satan walks about as a lion, roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. He didn't play by the rules that we play with. He doesn't play fair. He touches us at our weakest point, and don't make a mistake about it. He knows what your weak points are. And Peter made that mistake. And so oftentimes we make the same situation, the same mistake. Peter went into a place where temptation was going to be particularly strong. We need to recognize that the times may come that we multiply the chances for us to fall by going into places where temptation is going to be so strong that we just don't resist it. We need to recognize that Satan has many snares, and deception is one of his art tools that he uses. Jesus has promised, there have no temptation taken you but such as man can bear. God is faithful. He will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation make also the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. That's the promise Jesus gave. He won't allow me to be tempted above that I'm able. But we may, if we're not careful, place ourselves in a situation that temptation is strong, far stronger than we recognized, and place ourselves in a situation that we fall, that you may be able to bear it. Escape is never easy. It's something that we have to grit our teeth about. Say no when we want to say yes. We have to stand and stand against the wiles of the devil. Peter did change. He did turn. And ultimately he did do what he told the Lord that he was ready to do. I'm ready to go to death and prison for you. And he did go to death for the Lord, and he was in prison. But it was a time of growth process for him, because in these dark hours before Jesus was taken and crucified, Peter was tempted sorely, and he fell. My friend, Satan is very much alive today. Let us, therefore, flee even the very presence and the very thought of evil. Thank you for listening. May God bless you, and may you have a blessed day.